Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of Learning Collective. I'm really excited because this will be our first panel discussion here on Learning Collective, and we've got two insightful experts talking today, sharing their experiences and insights about gathering data and establishing goals and metrics for your learning program. Joe Ganci and Mike Hruska, and I'll introduce them in a second here, although I highly doubt that they need any introduction, as well as our own Duncan Welder joining the conversation to share in his experience with XAPI on gathering data. I'm really excited, as I mentioned, because this will be our first panel discussion, and I hope that this conversation will continue to engage folks out there and add to this discussion on making sure that we are establishing goals and making sure that we are really focusing on business outcomes and how to get to those business outcomes. So here we have in the lower corner, Joe Ganci. He's got his name displayed up. So I'm going to just read a brief introduction for Joe. Joe is the owner of eLearningJoe, excuse me, a custom learning company. Since 1983, he has been involved in every aspect of multimedia and learning development. Joe consults worldwide and teaches at conferences and client sites. Joe writes tool reviews and is the recipient of several awards for his work in e-learning, including a Lifetime Achievement Award in 1999 and an eLearning GuildMaster Award in 2013. His mission is to improve the quality of e-learning with practical approaches that work. Welcome, Joe. And then Mike Hruska is a technologist and design thinking practitioner with experience spanning across standards, emerging technologies, learning, and science. Mike provides technology, business model, and innovation solutions to Fortune 500, government, and startups. His team has built award-winning products and solutions supporting millions of users around the globe. Mike's experience spans the continuum between advanced research on adaptive learning ecosystems and emerging technology product design in a variety of industries. So welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you. Thank you. So Mike, how do you pronounce your last name there? Hruska?
My own family doesn't agree. One side says Hruska, the other side says Hruska. You can call me Mike.
And I grew up in New York first, and then we moved to Italy. So everybody was calling me Ganci and Ganci, and then I moved to Italy. When I was 14, we moved to Italy, and they said, no, it's pronounced Ganci. And never more have I been able to say it any other way. So it's Ganci.
Ganci. Okay.
Do you have to use the hand motion too? When
Yeah.
I should say welcome, Joe Ganci, right? So welcome again to everyone out there viewing. If you are viewing us live, please feel free to drop in comments and questions, and we'll make sure that they are addressed. And if you are watching this in the replay, again, feel free to put in your comments and questions too, as they will be addressed by our guest panelists today. So, gentlemen, let's get started with our conversation. Goals and metrics. Those are kind of scary words for folks a lot of times, whether you're in L&D or any other industry. So let's start with kind of what are the steps needed for an L&D department to establish benchmarks and goals for a learning program. And Mr. Ganci.
I like to start by saying the very first thing that we need to establish is a willingness, because truthfully, I found over and over and over that a lot of organizations, I'm an independent contractor and I work with so many different organizations, governmental, commercial, nonprofit, whatever. And I'm also involved a lot in blended learning. Now with blended learning, you get a little more difficulty in having across the board evaluation and assessments happening. But stepping back for a second, I have found that most organizations are very, very hesitant about wanting to have any kind of metrics at all. And part of me thinks, oh, it's because they don't want to know, really. Part of it is because they're always in such a hurry, and it always adds another layer of I wouldn't say complexity, but certainly there's a little more to know and do. And usually you have to involve, their participation somehow. And so it's not only myself. I know I've talked to a lot of other learning experts in the field, and they often find that the very first thing they have to do is try to convince them how important it is to have metrics in place and be able to generate really good reports that show just how well their courses are working, whether they're online or not, and whether, their people are actually improving, or maybe they're even retrogressing from what they learned. So I think the very first thing is a willingness, and then of course following steps after that. I'll set up for a second and let someone else step.
And what would you say about that, Mike? I think that's a great point, willingness. And what would you add to that, Mike?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So, I spent my first few years at the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the Gov research space, and group was in a huge metrology division thinking of measurement. So I just thought it was germane that everybody thought about measurement all the time. And what I find really interesting is I've walked into a number of meeting rooms and workshops and meetings themselves where someone said, we want to implement X API. I said, I think that's a fantastic idea. Why? I said, because we should. And I said, but what don't you know that you want to know that you are prevented from knowing? What is the purpose of your inquiry? What insights do you hope to be able to gain? And it's very interesting. I think there's a history of maybe limited metrics that might come from L&D, and because the connectivity across the enterprise isn't just onboarding and training and preparing people, but actualizing them in terms of performance, it persists across a lot of data systems to understand that something actually had transfer, someone given an opportunity to practice actually developed mastery. That mastery drove individual and business performance in some ways. So it's very ethereal, and people aren't used to asking to say, like, is our training effective? We have leadership principles in our organization, and we've spent millions of dollars on those principles, and then people are supposed to espouse them. But does that make a difference in our customer base, our customer perception, our market position, our stock price, any of those things? And so when looking at a framework, passion for understanding something that an organization currently doesn't understand, as Joe says, that's right on. There has to be the willingness. Second is the fact that people need to accept that whatever data we get, it needs to be used to inform and improve what we're doing. The data shouldn't be used as something that's punitive for people. The data should be used to empower a process of continual improvement, whether we're changing the learning or we're changing the systems or we're changing the people. Whatever that is, the data is going to be used to inform some type of change in the future and not punish people.
No, good point. And what to Joe's point about willingness, do you think it's because they're not sure of how to go about establishing goals and metrics, and that's why the willingness is not really there? Or do they feel like data is punitive, as you mentioned, Mike? And then I'm glad you brought up X API, because I want to have Duncan chat a little bit about it here in just a second.
May I? I think it can be another reason as well, which is simply inertia and a bit of laziness, perhaps. I wouldn't say laziness. I would say more of, oh gosh, another thing to put on my list. It's that people are overburdened, especially now with fewer people having to wear more hats, especially. So when you come to them and say, okay, this is what we need to do, and we need to involve you, it's like, I can't right now, And so it's a question of, I'm just too busy to worry about that. I think what really works for me in the end is showing them, follow the money, to convince them that if they're going to spend this much on creating a proper learning curriculum of some kind, doesn't it make sense to actually works? Just like when you put together a marketing plan, if your sales go down, that's one thing. If your sales go up, it's another thing. With marketing and advertising, you tend to have more of a direct relationship between the quality and quantity of that versus, the results. Whereas with learning, it's a little bit more nebulous. And this is why sometimes they don't necessarily buy in right away, because think about it for a second. If you were to attend a classroom session, within your organization, or an online session of some kind, whether it's synchronous or asynchronous, and then you finish, and you take an assessment of some kind, and you do really well on that, right? How do we really know if that course was effective or not, right? Well, we want to see improvement on the job, but improvement on the job is usually not immediate. It's usually over time, right? And so let's say 6 months later, they're seeing that numbers are up, people are more productive, whatever. Was it because of that course 6 months before, or was it because of some other program or some other informal thing that might be happening with their organization? Is Jack over there doing so much better because he's always talking to Jill, and Jill is the one who is telling him, is mentoring him in essence the whole time. And so he's gotten much better. Now, is it because of that, or, so we can always kind of figure there's a foundational base there that the original course gave, but how do we really know how much of that improvement came from the original? That's where we've met a lot of, difficulty, just because sometimes you're not working in a vacuum. You're not able to really determine one-to-one relationship there. The only thing you can see is whether a trend is happening and in the right direction after the fact. So I'll address this later, but there are a number of ways that I have tried to implement things that would assist in that process. But I don't want to hog up the conversation. So we'll
have plenty of time on that, Pete.
Yeah, I was going to mention there. You said how to convince or what the hesitation is. This is one of my early learning kind of lessons. When I was first out of grad school, I was working for a refinery doing operations training, and we needed to our fuel costs were high, right? So to lower fuel costs, we were doing some training on maintaining steam systems, steam traps, and those kind of things. If you don't waste steam, you don't have to fire boilers as hard. You save money on. All of this information is tracked. So this, to me, as a child, idealistic, thought this is the perfect evaluation study, right? I know what we're spending on stuff today, on fuel. I know how much it costs to do training. We had to buy equipment like stethoscopes that they used. You had to buy supplies. But I could look at the end and say, all right, this is how much we were having to fire boilers beforehand. This is how much we had after. This is some kind of correlation. What is that correlation? What does that look like? And I had the operations manager say, welder, we don't even post-mortem engineering projects under $30,000. And that was it. I'm like, oh, all right. I guess so. One, a couple points. One, I think we get trapped in looking at things that are exclusively learning data, which isn't necessarily what we're going for, right? My metric should not be how many tons of human I train every year. That's not an effective goal. But also, how do you partner with those business units that can say, yeah, this is something that we do need to evaluate. Like Mike said, the limited connectivity across the organization, right? We can't live in this side of only being concerned with learning data if we really want to look at how what we do impacts the organization.
Absolutely. And that's a great segue, because my next question to you, gentlemen, was, would it be fair then to say you've got to start with what the business outcomes and goals are for the overall business? So that would be engaging with possibly the C-suite or other leaders who could share this and give you insight. And from there, you would be able to develop better the goals and benchmarks for your learning program. Mike,
nothing else makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, and if you don't mind, you want to switch to my screen share for a second?
Sure.
Yeah, so I mean, you brought up the key thing here is this isn't just working inside of learning and development. This is working across the organization, and no matter what size organization you are, the goal of L&D is to get everybody to be everything they can be in the org. And so you guys have probably all seen this. This is the LinkedIn Learning Workplace Report. This is Fortune 500 CEOs that say, number one business thing I want is impact from anything. Number two thing I want is ROI. Only 8% of these CEOs are actually seeing the impact in their business from L&D, and only 4% say that they see the LOI. I'm an advisor for HR.com, and we did a survey last year about the perception. So now we're looking outward, and now we're looking at ourselves as L&D organizations. Only 16% of people said we are good, we're awesome. And only 22% of people said our learners are actually engaged. And to have some empathy, like, we face a lot of challenges, and this is some data from ATD. whether it's aligning training to the business or working with subject matter experts or measuring results and outcomes, which is the #1 challenge that people indicate in the space. We have a huge challenge from perception, the way we think about things. So our biggest challenge isn't to do the work. It's to get people that are collaborators that we're connected with that believe that the work is worthy to be done. And what I've found in my conversations is that there are 3 questions that are absolutely critical. How do we know where we should be focusing our efforts? Yes, we have X people in our L&D department. Yes, we can turn out Y amount of training. But what does the business really need? And also, most importantly, because we can't do everything at once, how do we actually prioritize these things so that we know that our efforts and investments are being made in the right things? And then how do we know if it's actually working along the way? So I think those things are really critical questions that we really need to think about. So you can kill my screen share for now.
Okay.
You know,
we just saw infinity. I saw the infinity there of this infinite screen share.
Oh, yes.
That's always fun. You know, you hit upon something that didn't surprise me at all, which is the level of engagement that learners feel in their learning. The truth is, most of the time, especially when they're on the job, most people aren't keen on the idea of going to a classroom or to take learning online. First of all, most learning online is just not well done, right? It's boring. It's linear. It's next type of learning. There's no engagement there. It's just basically, you know, read this, do this, and a lot of times it's just, you know, your checkbox that you have to check off on a list. So nobody really likes that. Nobody does. I was in line at my bank not that long, and this lady came over to me, introduced herself as the new vice president, the new branch manager, I should say, and she said, you know, what business are you in? And I told her, and she says, oh, e-learning, huh? I'm like, yeah, I get that a lot, right?
I had that conversation yesterday.
Exactly. You get that a lot because people are bored to tears by the e-learning that they have to take. And even in a classroom, sometimes the facilitators are the most boring people in the world too. They might be experts in the field, but they don't know how to teach, right? And so we don't take good care of creating experiences for learners oftentimes that allow them to want to be engaged. And going back to the idea of the business goals as well, if you can convince the learner just through the material that they're going through, the experience they're having, that this really matters to their job by presenting, for instance, case scenarios that are very pertinent to what they do, and allowing them to try different outcomes to see what happens, you know, if they do this, if they do that, you know, doing a branching approach where certain choices go in that direction, certain choices go another, and having things like delayed feedback. You know, if the surgeon is trying something new, a new operating procedure, or maybe it's a heart procedure, and he or she accidentally clamps the wrong artery, they may not even realize that for a minute or so until they see the patient is suddenly in distress, right? And so sometimes it's good to delay feedback, because in real life, you don't always know immediately when you get something wrong. You know, you do something in real life and it's like, wrong. No, what? That, you know, that's not how real life works. Why do we always set up our assessments and our learning so that immediately we're being told we're wrong? And so most people are like, wrong, okay, wrong. Oh, right, I got it right this time. Let's keep moving. And yes, that's essential to me. If we don't give them an experience that they will want to engage in, then what's the point of it at all? And so much money is being wasted creating things that people hate.
And you're right. It boils down to kind of that mentality of what's in it for me, because the end user, the end learner, isn't going to see that, oh, it's going to hit the ROI numbers, or it's going to hit this business goal that the C-suite wants to hit. They just want to see the connection between their learning and possibly their performance, as Mike had brought up as one of the points that we wanted to discuss. But really, what's in it for me?
Make them feel like heroes in the learning. You know, make them feel like they're solving problems. Everybody likes to be Sherlock Holmes. Everybody likes, you know, to solve a mystery. And if you can give them a challenge and let them solve it, they feel great about it.
Absolutely. I think, Duncan, you were about to start a point before I so rudely interrupted you.
Oh, no, not at all. I was, I was going to say, you know, kind of based on that, you know, discussion around engagement. I think we do a disservice, or have done a disservice in a lot of instances, where there is such a baseline of often regulatory compliance training, things that are not necessarily focused on business performance. Now, clearly, you need safety training because if you have accidents that are an issue, but those things, I think, sometimes can be overwhelming to students and put them off of the entire process altogether. And then the other side that you mentioned is, what are the measures that we want to use to even gauge that? Right? I mean, do I need to start looking at learners that are involved in forums or discussion groups to measure their engagement, or how frequently people log on, or if people are searching for courses versus that they want to find, versus only taking courses that are assigned because you have to take these as a condition of employment. So, what are those different ways we can measure things like engagement that are fairly soft there?
Yeah, that's a great point. And how do you go about doing that? So then how do you measure engagement, or obviously with performance, you've got some things that you can measure, or metrics you can analyze, such as if they did the job correctly, or but what metrics should be analyzed, and in thinking about that, how what data points, or where do you gather the data? I know you'd mentioned XAPI, and that's the big buzzword right now. It's the cool new thing, but I know that there are other ways to gather data besides XAPI. So I'd love for you to share a few of the ways to do that, Mike, without XAPI, and then we'll chat with Duncan about XAPI specifically.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you wouldn't mind, go back to my screen share. I want to level set on a few things, because XAPI, and I won't steal any of Duncan's thunder, but he knows I've been on this thing a long time, and it is a way to do something, but the question is, what is worth doing? Yeah. And so to kind of level set here, I want to differentiate between a few things: measures versus metrics. We often hear these terms interchangeably used. So your height, your weight, your temperature, all of those things are a measure of something, though. It's not necessarily a metric associated with you, because a metric is a calculation using two measures. So body mass index, now we're starting to get movement away from a singular measure towards a metric of what could be used to understand something like health or wellness in some way. And it's not this individual measures that we want to understand. It's actually some type of metric that we could use to say, how does that metric change through time? And what are things that we can do to change that? Duncan, you brought up something before that reminds me of the 3 C's, causality and correlation. So if my head turns no and my finger's attached to it, it looks like the causality is here, that my finger's really pushing my head. It just happens those two things are happening at the same time, which is actually correlation and not causality. I'm not really pushing my head. But the confounding effect is, if Joe were saying something and I were doing this, you might think I don't agree with Joe, but in actuality, my neck's just sore and I'm just twisting it around in some way. So I think it's really important to consider measures and think about measures and putting the right measures together to form metrics. And ultimately, when we're looking at data, considering the idea that for this given metric, we might see something that moves it, but is it causality or correlation, or is there some confounding effect that's out there? And I think the other thing to think about too that's really important is time binding associated with this. So you have lagging indicators and leading indicators in any given system that are there. The one really good lagging indicator is revenue. At the end of the day, all the work gets invoiced for whatever the business someone is in, and there's this great looking out the rear view mirror. But to tell someone, go ahead and improve revenue, well, they're not going to focus on revenue. They're going to focus on a lot of other things, and those other things have leading indicators associated with them, that help you look through the windshield and steer, and not say where did I end up or what's behind me, but where am I going and how am I getting there? So I think these things are really important items to consider along the way. As you're building, there are a lot of things that you can measure. And my typical approach is to say, top down, zoom out and zoom in. What are the things that we want to know? What is worth knowing? And what are the priorities of knowledge areas? What are the insights that we might develop? And then start bottom up and say, what are all the things that we know that we can measure today? And then if we started to develop some composite idea of those by combining two and potentially more measures, what is the connectivity between the insights and those metrics?
Joe, what would you add to that? And what do you think about leading and lagging indicators?
Well, I actually touched upon that earlier when I mentioned, how it's hard to know sometimes because of that lag, whether something is being effective or not. And I thank you, Mike. You really made that more formalized in your approach, and I appreciate that. I'm reminded of a couple of things where we get I see extremes in this field. Okay. I was working at a government agency a few years ago. I was there for 2 years, and I was creating a Spanish language program there for them, to teach their people that are out in the field, especially. And there was I came to understand eventually that there was this office there where these two people worked, and the whole time that they were there, they were putting together a way to determine what the metrics were, and how to measure things, and so on. And they were basically using, at the time, this was a while ago, they were using Scantron, types of tests. So they were constantly generating, Scantron data. And 2 years later, they still hadn't really come up with anything. I mean, they had all this data and they had all this insight, and yet they had no solution. And they were actually shut down, that office, because it was like 2 years later, nothing is yet. And so that was one extreme. The other extreme is actually more common, which is, not measuring much at all. And so it reminds me of a friend of mine who works he works in a different country in the same capacity that I do. He told me once that, I think he might have used this in one of his talks once. He said that this smallish company, 500 people, whatever, asked him to come and evaluate their e-learning course. And by the way, we need to also differentiate between evaluation and assessment, because those two terms are often intertwined when they really shouldn't be. Anyway, they asked him, they said, look, we just finished it. Everybody in the company's taken this course. But we always know we can do better. We'd like you to come and take a look. So they posted it online for him to look at first, and then he went in, and before they could ask him any questions, he started asking them questions. He said, okay, so tell me, how long is the seat time for this? And they said, it's about 17 minutes. He said, that's right. That's how long it took me to go through it, about 17 minutes. He said, and how many people have completed successfully this? Gosh, I think it's 98 and 99%. I mean, it's like almost everybody did. Okay, great. Can we determine too, then, knowing it's 17 minutes long and knowing the completion, can we generate some reports from your LMS? Because they did have an LMS. And they were like, sure, whatever, So they went and did that, and they came back, and he said, okay, so how long did the average user go through this 17-minute course? And no, this can't be right. What? And it was like 2.6 minutes. And so, how is that possible? Well, I'll show you how that's possible. Next. It was a very linear course. Nobody was paying attention to it. Oh, but wait a minute, they said. They all passed the assessment at the end, so maybe they already knew this stuff and they didn't really need to go through the course. Okay, let's take a look at that. Well, the assessment had 5 questions on it, and you could go through it as many times as you wanted to pass it. And so eventually they realized the average learner had taken it like 4 times, and all they were really doing is doing, what the last what they didn't answer correctly last time. So they were shocked, and they said, we spent $37,000 for this, and now it proves that we don't have a clue. Yes, because first of all, you didn't create a course that anybody really wanted to take. But secondly, you didn't put in any kind of measurements that really mattered here. And so all they were measuring was amount of time and whether they passed. They didn't even pay attention to that much. Okay, so let's start there. But then having a course where proper measurements can be taken along the way, and then you can see what the metrics are at the end. Have they improved? Are they showing that they are able to more effectively meet a challenge, later on in the course that they couldn't earlier in the course, that sort of thing. So I see both extremes, but the one that's much more common is the latter one. The former one I've seen only once or twice, where people go so nuts over, data that all they focus on is data, and they never actually come up with any solutions. In the end, that helps. So.
Oh, no, that's a great point, and it speaks. Duncan and Art often speak about you just because now you can gather all this data, should you, and why would you even want to? And so what data should you gather? And that comes back to knowing what outcomes and goals that you need to meet, correct?
Sure.
So let's talk a little bit about XAPI, that trendy thing.
It's been trending a long time.
I know. I that's what I'm saying. I'm surprised the length of time that XAPI has been here in the industry, and how there's so many folks who are still like, oh, we got to do something about this. So, Duncan, would you like to share some?
I'd say that we're guilty as an industry, and I think probably everyone is, of always being attracted to the newest and shiny thing. So there is, and I saw this, age myself some, but when SCORM came out, we had people that would send in a proposal or show up at a trade show and say, "Hey, we have to have SCORM." It's like, why? I don't know, but it was the thing, right? AICC is out. SCORM is the new, shiny penny. So for folks that are not aware, XAPI is really just a way of recording data in a consistent syntax, so you can report on it. But anything essentially could write an XAPI statement. So it could be that Duncan launched a online program, or I did satisfied a checklist on a phone. So really, I'm just looking at those kind of smaller completion items there. The problem is it's pretty easy to collect junk data. One, because you collect everything, and it's not consistent there. But also, if I just gather everything, I end up with this pile of data, and it's not likely I'm going to magically see a trend rise out of that. So if you want to see, like Joe mentioned earlier, the people clicking directly through that content, if you had some kind of interactions or elements inside that content that you wanted to see if they were used specifically, right? Are people watching this video? Are they flipping over this card to look at the definition on the back, or whatever the case is there? Those are places where it's probably not valuable data for you. Analyzing the student, it might be looking at student behaviors going through, but certainly from evaluating your own content. So, again, kind of looking at, are we evaluating the student? In which case, gosh, we might need to look at all of the things that he or she does going through a learning path, and compare that to non-learning data, right? Some kind of business data at the end, and really look at the learner side. We can also use things like XAPI to evaluate again some of that level of engagement and the value of content there. That does not solve the issue that Joe mentioned about all your assessments not being valuable and tied back to the actual objectives of that course, right? That's our core, right? We need to define what you want someone to be able to do at the end of training, and you build training to close that gap. So yeah, those are the things on that jump out to me on the XAPI side specifically there. Mike, what are your thoughts on that front?
Well, I mean, I have a couple, and it would take a couple hours to talk the level that I would love to talk about them. But I'll say this, slightly before the first 1.0 version of the XAPI spec, I started a multi-year Army Research Lab funded effort to help to understand how you might use XAPI to do some advanced things, empower adaptive learning ecosystems, intelligent tutors, apply it to simulation, a lot of things. And the number one thing that we learned in all of it is you're probably at some point going to want to do training effectiveness evaluation or do some type of adaptive system recommendation, or maybe some like learning path rather than a micro adaptation. And if you want to do that stuff and you want to connect the idea of learning and performance, you have to frame things within competency. If you don't have an understanding of your competency framework, you can collect all the darn data you want. You're never going to be able to put it together in a meaningful way for any potential, for any kind of correlation or actually understanding causation. So you imagine a population, a cohort of folks that goes through some experience, and there's a distribution of their existing performance going to that. We have our rock stars, we have our wannabe rock stars, we have our never going to be rock stars. But we might notice that some of the never going to be rock stars actually watched this video a whole bunch of times. And on the other side, they came out ahead of where the other never going to be rock stars were. And they were closer to the wannabe rock stars in some ways. So there are some things that you can really do at a certain level, which are really good. But if you don't understand how to frame and thread things through competency, I mean, there's many schools of thought on this. And I've argued on all sides of the fence, whether it's competencies or behaviors or KSAs, and all those things, as we know, can end up as ELOs and TLOs. There are many ways to do it, but you have to have something that's a data anchor between what someone's doing to learn to do something and what someone is doing with something, so that you can pull that piece of thread through there.
What's the ideal condition?
Mike, we should have another show with you and Duncan and Art back on. Then you three can talk about XAPI for several hours, right?
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
I think one of the challenges that I see in the L&D arena is very often by the time you get called in, the client has decided there's a solution that they need you to build, right? So it's not, all right, how do we close this performance gap or do this? It's like, I need, like you said, a 17-minute module on this, right? Here you go. Like, do you really? Right. You know, this is that whole thing. Why would I create training to teach you which is the start button and which is the stop button if I can just put start and stop on the button or make the buttons red and green? Right? There are things that are intuitive, and it doesn't make sense to force everybody to remember, you know, the top is the stop button. So how does that conversation unfold with stakeholders when say, gosh, you know, it's not really an order taking system. We should look at what the problems are and come up with the right solution for that.
That's a really good point. May I at this point? You remind me, of course, of how traffic lights at one time, you know, we're so used to seeing red on top and green on the bottom. But in New York City, when I was growing up, we also had it horizontally, where red was on the left and green was on the right, you know, and they had to stop doing that because for people who, especially were colorblind, which one was red, which one was green, they couldn't really tell. And they could tell if it was the top one that was lit up, you know, it was red. So yes, of course, you know, user experience, the intuitiveness of the system and all that. But if you don't have to ask a question, why do you need to, you know, train on it? Okay. Mike mentioned learning paths, and I use that term a lot too, because one of the ways that we can tell if somebody's really learning something is not whether or not they passed an assessment at the end of a course. Because, you know, I got a computer science degree as my, you know, when I was in college, that was my degree, Bachelor of Science in Computer Science. And I'm going to tell you right now, some of those classes I had to take were not of interest to me. You know, why did I have to take statistics? Why did I have to take physics and I think chemistry? No, calculus. I had to take calculus. And I went to my department chairman and said, why? I'm a computer science guy. I like to code. I like to program. Why do I have to, you know, take calculus in this? And he says, well, the thing is, there's so much of a demand for this department, and we have to glean out the ones who are serious about getting this degree versus. So I have to suffer now through these classes just because there are too many people wanting me to take, you know, go after a computer science degree. But, you know, whatever. That meant that, look, those classes where they never saw a need for them, yeah, I passed them. I did well, but it was cramming at the last minute sometimes for a test. And that's often what we see in L&D too, is people pass an assessment, but then the day after, they're probably not going to remember much of anything because they did it all at once. They just learned it, and all they're really proving is their short-term memory is working pretty well. Okay, just as we do when we cram on some for some exam, short-term memory from the night before. Well, okay, so how do we know? Well, if we're presenting approaches that involve the learner to solve problems, case scenarios, whatever the case might be, and then okay, so listen, when I got my computer science degree, was I now an expert in computers, programming? No, I had graduated. It took a while before I could call myself an expert in the field, and the same is true for any course that we take online or in person. We graduate, we are not yet an expert. Okay, it takes a while to get to a level of expertise, and it depends a lot on content and also on the learner and whether they have time or not as well. So it could be that they're an expert and a week later. It could be a month. It could be a year. It could be 10 years. It depends a lot, right? How do we know, though, if they're reaching expertise? How do we know if we're getting there? It means that we can't just rely on that initial course. We have to keep following up with them and see and present to them weekly, monthly, bi-weekly, whatever the case might be, whatever makes sense for the particular situation, but present them with similar or even exactly the same scenarios, 2 months later, and see, did they do it quickly this time using XAPI or another means to measure their time, to measure their the number of times they chose, did they very quickly understand the situation and able to solve it this time? Whereas the first time they did it, no. So we can see a trend, we can see a metric in place that shows that they are improving over time. But we can't just rely on that initial time and say, oh, well, now they're experts. And they're not. They're graduates. We need time to become experts. And that's where we can continue to assist them by repurposing a lot of that initial piece and giving them bits and pieces along the way where they get a weekly email. Click here to answer this. It takes a minute. They pass it fine, great, that's measured. If they don't pass it, hey, click here and take a micro lesson on this again, so that you can remember how to do this, that sort of thing. That's really that can really work, but not where we're just simply assessing how well they did on that course initially and then expect them to be experts forever. No, it doesn't work that way.
Right, because it seems like many people, children do this, or they're taught to learn to the test, as adults do too. You want to pass the test, pass the assessment, but how much of that do you actually retain? And most people learn as they practice what they're learning. And so hence the need for additional performance support, as you mentioned, Joe. And so then what? What are those steps? And you have to build this into the goals for your learning program, right?
And of course, I will say one more thing, that it's important that whatever they're doing, they do see as important to what they are doing on the job. Because if it's not pertinent to the business goals and to their own personal employment goals as well, it's who cares, if they do well or not, or they don't care, I should say.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, what's in it for me? It's aside from, yes, I get to keep my job, but how does this help me to perform my job by this training? And Duncan brought up, knowing the outcomes or the business goals, overall business goals. And Joe and Mike, both of you are basically consultants who would come in, outsourced consultants. So are these overall business goals and outcomes typically shared with you, or is it just a matter of, as Duncan mentioned, you come in, they say, we need a 17-minute module that people will actually pay attention to?
It's a great question, and I'll use a segue from the question that Duncan asked, which is, a lot of times a conversation happens in an organization. They say, oh, it must be a training problem. We need to train on this thing. It needs to be this long. That's how much time we have available for a person. There's 4 questions that I use, because you weren't there when that conversation happened a lot of times, right? So the 4 questions I ask are, what do you want? How do you know that you want that? When you get that, what will that give you? And how will you know? Those 4 questions are absolutely amazing. And so, I had a company which was acquired last year by Allen Interaction. So I've been able to work with that team there and really do some amazing things that kind of start before someone forms the opinion that someone says, we want onboarding to be better. We want internship program. We don't have any idea other than we just want our next round of employees to come through that internship program. So starting with those types of greenfields is amazing, and I really, really enjoy that type of thing. But if you would mind, flip to the screen share. I want to show you guys two really simple ways that we approach this problem. One, and I'll provide the URL in the chat for you where you can get these types of tools. One is a very simple way, because you can't zoom up from a situation. If someone says, I need 17 minutes of safety training, and you don't ask those 4 questions, you can't zoom up. You have to zoom out before you zoom in. So this is something called the Learning Ecosystem Canvas. There's some facilitation questions on here, but it helps you really understand what value proposition someone's trying to deliver generally, what types of relationships are they trying to build, what are the learner segments that we're targeting, what are the channels, and then what are the value metrics around that. And it's a visual tool. You can print out a template and use Post-its on it, or you could put the PDF or the ping in Mural and collaborate. This is a wonderful data collection tool that you can use to really understand the space. And here's an example. This was like a 30-minute sprint with an organization. So they want to provide opportunities for intentional and relevant learning journeys for continued professional development towards enhanced collaboration, close development gaps, build common language, culture, and drive business results. Okay, if we just took that, we'd have to understand things like intentional and relevant. How would we measure relevance? What would the metrics be for relevance for someone? Could be XAPI data, could be some Qualtrics, some survey data there. We have to understand what are the development gaps today, and are we actually closing them? And are we building common language? Are we going to do computational linguistics on all the companies' communications? Probably not. If we're going to change things like culture, that's good. But having a strong value proposition at the core is central. The other thing I think that's important is matching the strategies to the desired outcomes. And so I'm just kind of flipping through something, but we have 3 modes that people need to learn in. They need to follow instructions, remember and follow instructions, or perform expertly. But what we typically do is just give them information, or give them all the information if we want them to perform expertly. But blending these things in some ways and providing opportunities for practice and challenge and simulation and stuff that I've learned greatly from Dr. Allen over the years. But here's the key thing. If you just think of a single business objective and you don't worry about the deepest level of stuff, and you say, what is that? And what is the outcome? It could be revenue, it could be performance. Say, what are the behaviors that people need to have at this intersection? Who are the people that actually perform these behaviors? What might be the KPI or measure or metric that we could understand if someone was performing this behavior? What's the performance outcome that we hope to achieve? And this is a really simplified version of this. And then what's the instructional treatment that we might use? Is it just provide information, or is it challenge and simulate things for them? And here'd be a really simple example for a new beauty consultant for Mary Kay. They need to deliver this genuine I statement. And there's a person that does it. And there's some KPIs. And what's the performance outcome that we're actually trying to get to? Whether they need to perform expertly, which fits the create budget and fit business goals, or whether they need to remember and follow instructions like demonstrate one core product line. And I am done sharing my screen. So
that was a great example.
There are ways to do this, and I'll throw a link in the chat, because I just want to see people do better. I want 16% of people to be 36% of people say our learning organization is great. I want to see 22% of learner engagement go to 82%. I want to see 99% of Fortune 500 and all CEOs say learning and development is the most indispensable part of my organization. And so I've compiled a lot of my work and Dr. Allen's work and Christopher Allen's work and a bunch of our folks, and put it all together at one single resource site. There's white papers, there's how-tos, and there's templates for all of this stuff to just get in the ring and start doing the thing tomorrow.
Just do it, right?
Yeah. And listen, there is a danger also us if we aren't involved in those initial discussions, because what often can happen if you're not careful is, they make this decision internally. It's going to be, we need training, we need this, it's going to be this much, and so on. And in the end, you may even give them a great result. You may give them a great course, but they still have bad results because that training really wasn't the solution after all. You know, it really wasn't the problem. The problem was that their gizmo was not, you know, oriented correctly or something else. And so who gets the blame in the end? Oh, well, this vendor, you know, just provided us with something that just didn't solve the problem at all. Well, whose fault is that? You know, the vendor had no choice in the matter. Of course, the choice could have been, I don't want to do this, you know, thank you very much, but I'm going to move on to someone else. But very often that can happen. You know, who's the person at the bottom of the ladder? That's the person who gets, you know, pooped on. So you want to be careful not to have that happen by ensuring yourself that whatever you're providing is actually something that's going to work for them and, you know, really assist them in their business goals.
Now, that's a great point, because we're so focused on the outcomes for training, but what if this product, as you mentioned, doesn't work, this gizmo doesn't work? So that's not really a training issue, that's their R&D issue.
Oh, and so often it's just easy to replicate something that you've seen, you know. So until people understand better that the longitudinal or that you know, repetitive, more spaced learning helps increase retention there, or, you know, like you said, with the opportunity to practice and look at other simulations and things like that, versus, you know, taking the test at the end. You know, I don't know many written. Can I say this fairly? Will, you know, will a written test ever document my competence to do something, not other than take a test? So, you know, it's the wrong assessment method.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm just wanted to feature Molly for just a second. She wanted to say that love the tweak on the mission model canvas, Mike. So thanks for joining us, Molly. And if you have any further comments or questions, please pop it into the comments below. This has been a really informative, insightful conversation. As we wrap up, I would love for each of you to share just some final thoughts about how to make this process not as painful. Joe?
Oh, me? Okay. Well, one of the things I always find, I chuckle a little bit, it's also frustrating, is that someone will hire me for my expertise and yet will say, oh no, we don't want to do that. You know, when I offer them a solution, it's like, no, we're going to go in a different direction. You know, we still want to use you, but no, we don't want. And then my choice is, well, then why are you hiring me? You know, you ask me for my expertise, you're asking me to help you understand what's needed here. But then when I present the solution to you, it's like, nah, you know, well, I'm sorry, that's your choice, of course, but then you could have done that without paying me for the privilege of knowing, you know, that you didn't want to do that. So the point again is, as much as we can be involved at the very beginning, the more we're going to be considered a stakeholder, the more we're going to be considered bought in, invested in the situation, and the more we'll be considered important to the situation, because after all, you know, you've been there since the start, etc. We don't always have that choice. But when we can, we really should take advantage of that, because we can be so much more effective in that regard. And then not just look at, here's a course we need to create, but what's the whole path to expertise from there?
Yeah, absolutely. Mike, what would you like to share some closing thoughts with us?
Well, in every problem space, there is the idea of space. So I would say that this is about getting breakthroughs, and not like major monstrously technology driven breakthroughs, but you have the learning and development organization, and we know our space. We're in you might say microcosm, but there's a micro space there. There's the macro space of the entire organization, right? And there's the meso space of the people that we serve. So when you think about data, when you think about measures, you think about metrics, there's metrics that can help us just do our darn job better, right? And those are things around engagement and outcomes. There are things that can make people do their job better, and that it moves us from micro to meso, and then meso to macro. That's another sphere. But at the end of the day, if we do our job and we help people do their job better, then the organization is going to be served better too. So it's all about space.
Mr. Welder.
Well, I was going to say, I think the thing that we ultimately want to do is really look at training as one of the final competitive advantages that businesses have, right? We have a remote and a fluid workforce that can move around. Technology can be purchased. So really the thing that I can do to be better than my competitor is to develop my employees faster, better, more efficiently, more effectively. And of course, that moves into business process and stuff like that too. But how do you do that? And like you mentioned, you really have to get in with those stakeholders on the ground floor and make sure that you're solving the problem that needs to be solved there. From that point, decide what you want to measure early, right? And it could be that you may need a highly technical solution. It may be a very simple thing to go out and do. So just try not to stay too boxed in putting a solution in place before you've done that analysis work, as hard as that can be. And remember that there are some very basic, simple measures that can be valuable. I worked on a project, a few years ago where I spent a couple months in Azerbaijan, and one of the problems that they had was just classroom utilization. They had 5 different training departments that would all schedule their own courses and then have 25% of the room full. It's like, oh, you know what? If you're using the same forklift and crane training group and the same class, go ahead and have the operations group or the maintenance group and this group talk to each other so that you could fill the room, right? So, this is just number of people in a seat divided by the number of seats in the classroom, and that was what they needed to say. Gosh, there's a lot of money left, right? Especially if you're flying instructors, to Azerbaijan from the UK or from the US. Hey, I want to take advantage of every bit of that space.
Oh, absolutely. And not operating in a silo, as was mentioned at the very beginning of our conversation as well. A quick question from Molly, and I think it could be answered from the link. We put the correct link in the comments now. Are there resources for the Canvas mapping for learning? Mike, is you find that there at the Allen Interactions link?
Yeah, everything is there around the Canvas, around looking at enterprise models, around looking at behavior change. And change management. Right? I tried to put everything I could in one spot, not just because we all need to be change ninjas, but we need to be change ninjas more than ever right now.
I will confirm that the link doesn't work.
I put in a different one.
Okay.
Mike shared another one. It was alleninteractions.com.
Gotcha.
So,
okay, thank you.
Thank you so much to both of you, Mike and Joe, for joining us today for this discussion. I have a feeling that we could have just kept going on. Yeah. there's much more that could be discussed about this topic.
That certainly happens every time we run into each other in real life, back when you saw people in real life.
Yes, back when you saw people in real life. So if anyone would like to connect with either of these gentlemen, I encourage you to do so. Joe is active on Twitter and on LinkedIn, and Mike is on LinkedIn, and I will include the links for both their profiles in the comments as well. And hopefully we'll get to see both of you in person, possibly at DevLearn.
I'm supposed to be there, so yeah, I hope to.
I know Duncan and Art are supposed to speak, so we'll see what happens. But again, thank you both for a really great discussion and conversation today. And I know, just personally for myself, I learned quite a bit. And if you guys are watching the replay, please feel free to continue to put comments and questions. We'll make sure that they are forwarded to either Mike or Joe or both of them. And as a reminder, this video does remain on our Facebook page. so you're able to access it at any time. And it will also be uploaded over to our YouTube channel here by tomorrow, most likely, and also available there. So you get to choose to watch on your favorite social media channel. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And next week, we've got Trish Uhl talking about performance support and blockchain. So that will be definitely a very interesting conversation for sure. So tune in next week at this channel on our risk page, and tune into the messages we'll have for the time slot for Trish Uhl's discussion about blockchain and performance support. So thank you again, both of you, Joe and Mike. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.